and welcome to a very special edition of the Current Bun, the place for all things current and not so current. Today we're listening into a public meeting as part of a tour of England with a student organiser from Germany called Lola. She'd been working in Kassel and successfully organised a student strike against war and militarism, with the threat of conscription hanging over young people in Germany. With billions being spent on rearming nations across Europe and the blockade of oil in the Hormuz Strait and the threats of even greater conflagration, possibly leading to World War III on the horizon, then I feel this is a very important discussion. We were talking about how workers can resist the pressure put on workers by patriotism and by the media and by right-wing politicians to enlist and go to war, and even for conscription, which Britain hasn't seen for 60 years, and how this can be fought and what a socialist world might look like.
I'm going to talk about the school strikes and general push for rearmament by the German government. In an effort to militarize the society, the German government is pushing towards the reenactment of conscription, which was suspended in 2011. This sparked the national students' movement with 50,000 students abstaining from school and marching on the streets last December, and the second school strike on March 5th with 50,000 students taking the streets across Germany. We see this movement as a starting point for a broader anti-militarist and anti-imperialist movement. German rearmament is a consequence of the relative decline of German imperialism. German companies no longer innovate as much as their Chinese and US counterparts and are falling behind in key categories like AI or semiconductors. That means that the German capital is losing ground in global market share to their rivals. To compensate for these losses, Germany must cling even more relentlessly to its European, Asian and North African periphery. The war in Ukraine has shown that Russian imperialism is capable of challenging German and European dominance, especially in all-important Eastern Europe. The German ruling class must assert its hegemony against this new rival. For now, it lacks the military capabilities to do so on its own. Until now, the US has used its military power to keep Russia in check, but the US has made it clear that its interests have shifted. They won't use military might to enforce German or European dominance against Russia. The US withdrawal from Ukraine shows German imperialism that it must become a military power by itself. So how are they doing it? What are they trying to do? In 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, Chancellor Olaf Scholz declared the so-called Zeitenwende, which means something like turning points of eras. The Zeitenwende marks a huge shift in public discourse towards militarization and rearmament. Shortly thereafter, Defense Minister Boris Pistorius spoke of Germany's need to become fit for war. In May 2025, Chancellor Friedrich Merz said that the German military should become Europe's strongest conventional army. The first concrete step were a special fund of 100 billion for the German military in 2022 and an additional budget of 500 billion for military and infrastructure in 2025. The expected military budget for 2026 is 108 billion euros, which is twice as much as in 2022. By 2029, military spending is expected to rise to 152 billion to meet 3.5% target. So, however, the German ruling class has one major problem with rearmament. It lacks the recruits to transition from the relatively small professional army to a mass army capable of taking on the Russian military. By 2035, the military is to be increased by 90,000 soldiers and by 200,000 reservists. Although the willingness to join the military is slightly increasing, it still falls short of the recruitment target set by the government. The Military Service Modernization Act of December 5th intends to change that. The law does not yet reintroduce full-blown conscription, but it's the first step in that direction. And government representatives already said that if the recruitment targets are not met, conscription will be reintroduced. And that's also how it's perceived by many students across Germany. All citizens turning 18 will receive a mandatory questionnaire. For men, answering is obligatory. Women can answer if they want, starting this year. And they are going to be asked something about physical fitness and willingness to military service. And everyone who considers in principle, so gives 0 to 10, 1 answer or higher, has to already undergo medical examination. And starting next year, every man turning 18 has to undergo medical examinations. So far, there has been no real movement against militarization and war preparation. Radical left-wing groups and old peace activists have raised the issue of rising military spending and protested arms deliveries to Ukraine. But there were never more than like a few hundred people on the streets. It wasn't possible to mobilize any masses. The situation is different with conscription. For an entire generation of students, it is becoming clear what militarization means for their own lives when things get serious, being drafted against their will to kill and die. Conscription isn't an abstract danger for many somewhere in a distant future, but a very real, tangible threat that could become imminent in the near future. Today, the law was passed. 55,000 students across almost 100 cities went on strike. These are numbers that no movement against militarization achieved before in the last years. Protests were quite radical. There was a fundamental understanding of the background to conscription, a fundamental understanding of imperialism and its connection to capitalism. Many students realized that militarization is not in their interest, that it's not an effort to defend freedom and democracy against Russian aggression, but rather to defend the profits of German capitalists. The strength of the movement is a result of a rapid development in consciousness of parts of the German youth which took part within the last year. In the beginning of 2025, there was this massive upswing in membership and participation for Die Linke, a reaction to the constant rise of AfD in polls. No, Die Linke is a reformist left party, pretty comparable to your party. Many people made the very important realization that voting alone won't stop the AfD and that it's necessary to organize to build an alternative on the left. The second big event for the German youth consciousness was the protest movement against genocide in Gaza, which took off last summer. Many young people realized the hypocrisy of the German ruling class and their human rights and international law propaganda. And they also saw the brutal reality of imperialist war. At the same time, the global struggle against the war with strike movements in Italy and the global summit flotilla showed many people what united action is capable of achieving. We as SFV had underestimated the potential of the movement before December 5th. We weren't expecting the protests to become that big or widespread. Through a stroke of luck, we were able to play a leading role in Kassel because we were already in a youth alliance against war and conscription, but also our comrades participated in most cities. The movement was back then and is still carried out by what we call red groups, which are a lot about radical aesthetics and not that much about the development of concrete analysis and strategies. You can often see them with like a red scarf with a hammer and sickle. They can win over parts of the radicalizing youth because they are received as energetic and youthful. The most important group that initiated the protest in many cities is the SDRJ, the German Socialist Workers' Youth organization of the DKP, the German Communist Party. There also, back in November, were students who started off school committees for school strike. And in hindsight, the idea of a school strike against conscription was definitely the right one. The SAJ was and still is leading the movement because they first came up with it and have the numbers to do so. But on December 5th, the SAJ was still an appropriate leader for the movement, but now they are slowing it down and becoming an obstacle. In February, there was a national school strike conference in which around 200 activists from all over the country came together to plan the next steps. I was able to go there as a delegate for Kassel, and during the conference, the movement leadership, the SLJ, made involvement of the union's youth organizations and the students' representatives policy of the movement. In doing so, tended to depoliticize the issue of conscription, because the unions and student councils are officially against conscription, most of them, but they criticize it in a way that's compatible with German imperialism. They are not conscription because it's a preparation for war. They are only against it because conscription is coercion. The whole movement tends to narrowly focus on conscription itself, because most of the activists think that you can't come at the students with terms like imperialism, imperialist war in Ukraine, Gaza, Rojava, that would overwhelm the students and confuse them. That's definitely partially true. You can't go to it like to a sixth grader or something, but the older students definitely have to hear something like imperialism. And this all comes from a lack of trust in the working class and the students. In the consequences for the striking students are becoming harsher. Their striking students were locked in their classrooms, so they couldn't go on strike. Or in Berlin, there also was a student arrested for holding a sign saying Merz leck Eier, so Merz lick balls, is now facing charges for that. So it's definitely they definitely have this drive to repression. The main goal of the movement must be to destroy any illusions in the bourgeois democracy and the European Union as something we're fighting for, and to radicalize the activists and students. The primary goal of the movement is to forge a radical core of anti-militarist activists who will participate in later struggles against war and imperialism. There are definitely also organizational difficulties, because it's difficult to organize schools on like national level, but there are definitely some good local examples. For example, at my school there was a career advisor for the German army, and around 100 students of mine gathered in a school back to participate in a demonstration against the military in their school, which is like a sixth of all the students, which was pretty good. And also a good thing is that we have the support of the union, the GEV, like the teachers union, in most cities. That's like a good thing to have, and we can work with that. In most cities, Die Linke wasn't part of the school strikes because they focus on like other things like rent control and stuff. And this definitely was a mistake of Die Linke. There is a campaign for stopping conscription, but the main goal of the campaign is to like get the members of Die Linke to go to schools and tables and tell the people how they can stop being conscripted. But it doesn't like have a political understanding that it's bad. It's just, yeah, here you shouldn't go to the military. It's not like nobody should go to the military. There are also some people in the party, which especially at debates, it's most people at the party are against rearmament, of course, and therefore there's an anti-militarism conference in June where there's like plan to get all those different strategies together in one coherent strategy against imperialism. And as FV members are one of the main forces who organized and built this conference. This not only will help the Die Linke to have a good impact in the movement, but also will get Die Linke on a better position at the question of war, and therefore it's important to have Die Linke on board, even though these red groups don't want them because they think they are all just like careerists and opportunists. So I think that this movement will be a good starting point to kick off an anti-militarist campaign in Germany, and maybe combine it with the here starting anti-militaristic campaign, international campaign against militarism and war. Yeah.
Hearing a bit on what's going on the ground in Germany, and I think, obviously the kind of militarization isn't just German, it's like basically global. So I think there's lots of stuff to discuss and draw parallel, bringing back conscription, I think a bit similarly in Sweden as well. And of course there's lots to talk about more generally with kind of anti-war and anti-imperialism, with what's going on with Iran, US and Israel.
I just wondered if you could say something about kind of the role of AFD and militarism, what's been their position, because I think that, I mean, in this country there's a lot of parallels obviously, and I think a lot of what you're talking about I recognise here as well. And obviously in Germany they've got the Alternative for Deutschland, and we've got Reform UK. It's been kind of interesting to see how with the growth of like militarism and the big imperialist wars taking place, actually the establishment parties have found themselves out of step completely with public opinion, certainly here. And then it's kind of exposing quite badly like Reform, for instance, who support very vigorously Trump's war on Iran and kind of those sorts of adventurous projects.
I wanted to ask about the left party, Die Linke, and as you were saying, there are contradictions in the way they address, well, the conversation on imperialism and militarism, but not just that. What happened last summer, two chambers of the German parliament, which are roughly similar to the one in the UK, so the House of Commons that is meant to be like the real parliament, and the House of Lords that should just rectify bills, but then they have power to block stuff, and Germany works in a similar way. The lower chamber, Die Linke voted against the militarization, but in the upper chamber they voted in favor. So I just wanted to know how the conversation developed in terms of kind of criticizing the people that voted in favor, or how that affected the perception of the left party.
You mentioned someone being arrested just for holding a placard insulting a politician. In the UK, just this week, there's been a march that was planned, has been banned in London in favour of Palestine and against the war in Iran. And we've seen attacks on democratic rights with the Public Order Act being used to clamp down on protest and direct action in this country. I think internationally there should be a campaign just to defend democratic rights. There's a similar process happening in Germany where people are being censored for speaking up against war and militarism.
Because we're as a small organisation, we can still manage to bring you over and have international speakers. It's very valuable. But once when we are active in your party, things like that, then these things, exchanges across countries, is going to become super important to learn the lessons of what's happening in Die Linke. So I think we have, Die Linke would be seen as something definitely that is very much aligned to what your party would want to do. And your party's come out with, one of the first things they did agree on was to have a position on Iran. But unfortunately, the position on Iran was never actually circulated. I don't think it was circulated before. It was sort of just read out, and it was agreed, because people were just generally like, the war in Iran is horrific, a terrible thing, and we should oppose it. But I think for new political parties, it's very important to not just be opposed to the war in Iran, but to be opposed to also against the regime there, and in support of the working class struggling against that regime, yet being very clearly anti-militarist, because there's obviously a lot of confusion sown in the newspapers, on television. Obviously they're trying to undermine the left at every opportunity we can, so we definitely don't need to hand them ammunition to make it easier. So there's some of the protests are obviously being characterised as pro-Iran, because we're against the destruction of Iran, an illegal war. I mean, that's obviously completely bonkers, but part of that flows from the fact that if people are not openly critical of the Iranian regime while also opposing militarism, our militarism, then it is seen as supportive of it. And so we have to understand everything's in the context of a hostile media, hostile education system. So we have to go out of our way to explain how we're opposing them and what the solutions are, and how we see the solutions developing in the future. And so the grassroots left, which is obviously the slate within your party's leadership, did put out a statement which was better than the original one that was put out by your party, and she's better than the one that's been agreed now. But everybody agreed to the more recent statement, even though it's wishy-washy and doesn't really say very much, because for the sake of just getting something agreed. Because you don't vote against a statement to oppose the war in Iran. But there was no opportunity really to amend it at that meeting, which is a big failing. And so the problems you have, like the sort of unwillingness of people once they get into elected positions or positions of influence where they're close to the capitalist machine to start becoming less critical of the capitalist machine is not something you can't just wish it away. It won't just go away. That will be happening in your party when we started getting elected officials. It will happen before then as well. So we have to have in place mechanisms to maximise democracy at every level of any organisation opposing militarism, and make it so that we can raise all the ideas I'm sort of suggesting openly within a new political party and win over people to the need to do what we think is necessary. And in an environment where the media is so wanting to demonise us all as supporting the Iranian regime, we have to spend a lot of time on explaining how that's not what we support. There's already been lies in the newspaper, not really lies actually, but people, when the war or the genocide in Gaza started, through struggling together against militarism and trying to link up with struggles like what's happening in Germany.
Germany is still a country with a very strong industrial component to the way German capitalism works. It's a country that has fell into a deeper economic crisis compared to other parts of Europe, and kind of embraced militarism quicker because it was a response to that as well. But at the same time, whereas you could say that in places like England you don't have people talking as openly about conscription or making the same amount of cuts to public services to fuel militarism, is not because they don't want to, but because they don't perceive it as something equally urgent. In reality, if we see what has been going on in England, is very similar in terms of general trajectory. So despite the fact that the UK is not part of the European Union anymore, we know that some of the investment programs promoted by the European Union to basically increase military production also involve British firms, including Rolls-Royce. Generally, the UK is quite central in terms of military production for Western countries. One of the biggest examples is a company that produces drone components for Israel. It's called Elbit, and there's also the factory here in Leicestershire, and there was a lot of people trying to get it shut down and protest outside of it. Lastly, there is one component of British capitalism. This is the role of Britain in Western finance. A lot of the investments that come through British finance or are mediated by British financial groups are then the investments that eventually end up fueling military production. So they just act as in-betweeners between different parts of the chain that leads to all of this military production. People have become a bit more aware of this in connection to the environment, because there has been some more open discussion about the role of Britain in fueling the ecological crisis. But a similar dynamic is at play also in terms of militarism.
Yeah, we're seeing across the board the kind of drive towards militarization. I think, as a response to just the crisis of capitalism, both as a kind of imperialist protecting resources. We're seeing the oil playing a role in the Middle East and the stuff in Venezuela recently as well, but also vying for dominance of world markets. So, the US was quite happy with the kind of unipolar world of the 90s, and now we've got China popping its head up and kind of challenging that. Quite good to have kind of a German perspective to start with, because it kind of reminds, I think it's quite easy to feel like it's Trump. Trump feels like the big baddie, and obviously, the Iranian government and Netanyahu, they're bad as well, but Trump is the big baddie. But I think it is important to remember that this is the system of capitalism that is driving this, and Trump is the representative of capitalism in the kind of belly of the beast of America. Biden was starting these processes before him. It's not unique to Trump, as it's not unique to the US. even if it's kind of a bit more extreme than in some other places. When things are bad at home, it's quite nice to have a war to distract people and kind of rally around. And we're seeing Trump's popularity dropping and recent bit of overreach of the ICE deployment, especially in Minneapolis, which has led to the first political strike against Trump, but some of the biggest protests we've seen against the current Trump administration. But also as another kind of case study, because it has actually been a really successful struggle in Minneapolis that our members there have taken part of. I think it was really positive, like the first kind of reaction of people forming the neighborhood, like getting together and protecting people and stuff. But in response, there was just escalation and Trump sending in like 3 times as many agents. The kind of original strategies kind of struggled, reactive and defensive strategies. So you had a lot of arrests and deportations of kind of protesters, and also the shooting of Renee Good. Like the importance of having a more like positive strategy, which was then put forward with the 1-day strike they had. We also supported and helped build. Like we're seeing, where they did actually back down after that, and actually the proper like threat to the profits of the local businesses, and it wasn't as total as it could have been. Now, where there's a new call that we're supporting as well for a nationwide version of like no work, no school, no shopping on 1st of May, International Workers' Day, which, if this is successful, it would be the biggest blow to Trump and his regime, far-right authoritarian regime, and as a way to like push like the working class as a class forward using their own power. It would be the first nationwide general strike in US history, and like that kind of action could have a really decisive impact. It could have the power to stop the Trump regime in its tracks, and would have, like, I think, really wide repercussions both in the US but also internationally for the anti-war movement.
Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, one of the biggest trade unions in the country, they represent a lot of workers in the industrial sector, and unfortunately the leadership has taken the view that military investment is a good thing because it's protecting members' jobs and actually growing that union, and not taking the correct position that you could protect jobs but also divest away from militarism and use the resources and billions of pounds being spent on weapons to actually help people instead. Which I think really is key. There was a plan called the Lucas Plan that developed in the 1970s by shop stewards and Lucas Aerospace, that's the name of the company at the time. But it's still very relevant today because they looked at what their skills could be used for in robotics and better batteries and things like kidney dialysis, which could actually be used to help people. And these skills are transferable. They don't have to be used just purely in militarism, and school students, is brilliant that you're getting such a response and lots of support from young people terrified of being called up to conscription. But the real thing that will stop this war in its tracks is workers actually taking action themselves and determined trade union leaders going on strike.
Important to know, not in just Europe but also in America, it's not just the left that oppose the war, it's also the right. Unfortunately, the right are opposing it for racist and anti-Semitic reasons. But this war isn't popular with anybody apart from a very select few, and I think we can see how Kemi Badenoch is outright lying and saying I never supported the war, and how Robert Jenrick is now backtracking what Tice said a few weeks ago. They know this war is going to make them lose an election, so they've suddenly backtracked. I think any US president would have known this war was a bad idea. I think the only reason why Trump did it is because he's a narcissist and he's a bit of an idiot, surrounded by yes men. I think we have to continue fighting against it, as workers. We have to. I also don't think it will go on as long as they were upwarded, simply because no one's getting enough support from it from any side of the political spectrum. The right are against it, the left are against it, even the liberals are against it. No one's supporting it. Fingers crossed that will stop. That will stop the Germans' conscription. Spain's already just flat out said we're not so helping the US, and so has Norway, Oman. Countries aren't scared to say no to the US. especially Starmer. I know somebody said that he might lose his seat to the Greens in the next election. I don't think he's willing to risk it either.
I just saw a statistic the other day that I think just distilled how imbalanced this current war is. And it was that the US's budget for its military is bigger than the GDP of Iran, and it's just like it's completely like similar in fact in many ways to the Israel and Gaza, and it's interesting as well that I think that they betted on the kind of regime collapsing, didn't they? Mm-hmm. And they thought they could do something similar to what they did in Venezuela, but they hadn't really kind of reckoned with the balance of social forces in the country like Iran, and that there is still some support for the regime, even though there's utter hatred for the regime amongst big sections of the population. I buy the idea that there was a degree of stupidity like in this. One thing that raises for me is that this idea of good imperialism and bad imperialism. This is always becomes an issue, right? Like, because it was one during the Iraq War when that started in 2003. There were imperialists who opposed that because they were like, this is a bad idea. That they could see that there are problems with it. It's useful to kind of remind ourselves the imperialism book, it kind of explains the context where imperialism comes from. Like, it's an analysis that's completely useful for today. It's absolutely fantastic and relevant. But one of the things that I really think it helps us understand is how kind of Marxists and so-called socialists ended up supporting things like war, and like the First World War in particular. But you can also imagine things like that happening today. Like politicians always come under a lot of pressure, so the solution for this is obviously democracy. But there are also other reasons why people support imperialism. Like, I think, like Drew said, that you've got trade unions have like so-called pragmatic view about jobs, and protecting jobs is very sort of chauvinistic view. Like this idea of the enemy, my enemies, my friend. And so people end up supporting like the Iranian regime because they're opposed to American imperialism, and it's just like Hamas. The Iranian regime is anti-worker. Like, they crush strikes, they crush workers when they try and engage in struggle. So we need to be supporting the left independently. I think we've seen that the capitalist system can withstand immense protests. Like, we've had ones like 700,000 over Gaza, but in Iraq war we had a protest of 2 million people, still didn't stop the war. We need to be arguing and winning the argument for strikes, and that's why I think the school strikes are so important, because it kind of raises this idea of the tactics of the labour movement. And the school strikes by themselves are going to be, I think, essentially important because they raise this idea, but they need to be connected to the labour movement more widely, because it's there that we have the capacity to shut the system down. The capitalists can withstand protests, but what they can't withstand is when we hit them in their pockets. And like, I think what you said about Minneapolis, Trump retreated out of there quite quickly when it became clear that workers were adopting those tactics.
Another key thing in building support for military action is patriarchy, and you can see that in the massive rise of far-right influencers and the Manosphere and stuff on YouTube. Again, like millions of views, because the two things are inherently connected. Militarism is in support of a lot of ideas of dominance that the patriarchy tries to push onto men as well. Just in general, there's a lot of overlap.
Before the meeting, I googled conscription in the UK, and here it ended in 1963. So we had it like during the World Wars, and then for extra security during the Cold War. The reason I looked it up, we did a stall on Saturday, and we had lots of young people stopping who were really shocked when we talked about the reintroduction of conscription in Germany, and they were like speculating about the prospects of Keir Starmer bringing it back here and saying, well, it seems like the sort of thing he'd do. Yeah, and one reason, like the current situation for the British ruling class, you know, in terms of the long-standing special relationship with the US, it's a nightmare for them because of Donald Trump, the impact that he has on the stability of the world or instability of the world, a big baddie and a narcissist, and just very unpredictable. And he doesn't care about the special relationship, doesn't care for Keir Starmer, but no one does. But it means like the UK needs to be able to survive without the support from the US that it's grown accustomed to. We're in this era that's marked by rising militarism, war, increased repression and discipline, the rise of an emboldened right wing, pushing of traditional patriarchal family values, attacks on our rights, and it really can feel like the clock is turning back, like in many ways. And then the thing that I wanted to talk about really was looming climate catastrophe, but the impact that war has on that. So there was a headline a few days ago that said the war in Iran is also a climate war. We've got right-wing leaders like Donald Trump dismissing climate change as woke nonsense. Here we had Keir Starmer U-turning on his climate pledges. And modern warfare is inextricably linked with climate change because of the huge amounts of emissions. Then those extra emissions drive deadlier heat, drought, storms, other impacts that wreck livelihoods, destabilise economies, spur migration, and then make armed conflict more likely. MI5 and MI6 warned back in January that climate disruption and biodiversity loss, if left unchecked, will cause crop failures, intensified natural disasters, and infectious disease outbreaks, exacerbating existing conflicts, starting new ones, and threatening global security and prosperity. So the outbreak of any war is bad news for the climate. We're hurtling towards, we're crossing all these tipping points and hurtling towards it becoming like an irreversible problem. And with wars and with climate change, it's the poorest in society who are impacted the most. So in the International Socialist Alternative, we're active in Germany, in England, Wales and Scotland, and many other countries fighting for a world that's free of war, inequality and oppression. 2021, we had a big intervention at COP26 in Glasgow. Over 300 of us were there. Climate movement's been at a low ebb since, but it's no less urgent. It's just that, there are lots of other things to protest, but they all have something in common. All of our struggles are against the capitalist system. Divide and rule tactics are used to distract us from the fact that a wealthy elite are hoarding more money than they could ever spend, or there are people on the planet who can't afford to eat, who don't have shelter, who die of curable diseases. There are enough resources for every single person on the planet to live comfortably. And Socialist Alternative, we want a socialist society run in the interests of everyone. We have our international campaign against war and militarism. We fight for trans rights, against sexism and misogyny, against racism and against the rise of the right.
In my country, Poland, conscription was abolished in around, I think, 2008 or 9. But then in 2022, they started pushing for voluntary conscription. Like in 2022, my brothers and my dad got given letters asking them to be like, hey, come to the reserves, sign up and stuff like that. And then I think 2025, they've ramped up that voluntary encouragement, specifically for men though. I don't think they've really pushed for men. It's always been just for men in Poland. I think whenever I go to Poland, I have to go to the government building in my town and commission myself. I don't know what it's called in English, but yeah, it's just like, it's ramping up there as well. It's definitely a very much global issue of remilitarization and strengthening armies all around, which was scary, really.
Do you think Poland was a response to Russia invading Ukraine?
I think in 2022, definitely. But since then, I think the president of Poland has used that as a point to steer Poland way more into militarizing even more and using more of the GDP. But his goal is to make Poland a military powerhouse in Europe, which, although the fact that there's the war in Ukraine, and now obviously with everything else escalating, it's just piling on to people also not wanting to really pay attention to the fact that so much money is going into this.
It's interesting because it's like a bit of a double-edged sword potentially. When you start recruiting more widely and people who didn't actively seek it out or don't even want it, then that changes the dynamic of the army as well. So like during the First World War, when the Russian Revolution effectively actually ended the World War, that was part of the dynamic that the people were so sick of the war. But the soldiers had a massive part of it specifically as well, because they were workers. And I think that's another problem that Trump has, that there's not popular support for actually feet on the ground in Iran, etc. So the kind of the actual popular resistance is there. That is a limiting factor. But
and I think we definitely need to stop the global wars happening. But we have to succeed, and I think we're not starting at a particularly strong point at the moment. Working class are quite disorganised, and I think that does put even more pressure on the people who are organised to get things right and to learn correct things from history and think about why we might have gone wrong in the past. And I think when Tom mentioned the Iraq War, of course, that was hugely significant in this country. In a lot of people, the lesson they learned from that is that protests achieve nothing, which is the incorrect lesson to draw from that. Our organisation was involved in that struggle against the Iraq War, and right from the beginning, we were raising the need for united industrial action against the war, and that was shut down all the time. But the trade union leaders, as we might expect, were sort of saying, well, the members are a bit more conservative than some of these radicals raising these ideas. And so in that situation, it was actually left to the students. The student strikes that took place when the war was launched was hugely important and could have had a huge catalytic impact on the trade union movement if people in the struggle against the Iraq War didn't sell out the movement. They weren't willing to put forward an industrial strategy for beating the capitalist class, which would link up with the students. If they'd done that, we could have been in a completely different world in this country and across the world. So the very least the thing to do is learn the lesson from that and not pretend that those student strikes didn't happen and there wasn't a potential in the workers' movement. You have leaders who are not willing to take strike action, then of course it's not possible for them to do it, but it's possible for workers at the rank and file to do it and force their leaders to do something. And I think that's what we take from that. And then there was that huge anti-war movement, and then that led to sort of creation of a new socialist formation, mass formation. But the critical thing really wasn't to build a new political party at that point. The point was to stop the Iraq War. And the method of stopping it never went away, but that's the importance of intervening with socialist ideas amongst masses of people in the trade unions, in new political formations all the time, because we need to win these arguments, because the future of the world is at stake. And I think young people can see the threat we all face and at least have the passion to push forward some of the most radical ideas, but they can't be detached from the rest of us in our workplaces around the entire world. And once those two are sort of linked up, I think we really have a chance of fighting for a socialist world.
So I do agree with you that the Iraq War protests, they weren't as, we didn't create short-term solutions of ending the war and stuff. I do think we did have long-term benefits to it, and I think the main one was people realising their power as a voter. Like looking at what happened during the Gaza war and how I was really involved with the Muslim vote, and they were encouraging people saying, do not vote Labour, here's an alternative you can vote for, and people actually listened to them. And that's how we got Shaka Adam elected, and that's how Liane Mohammed almost won the election from Ilford North, which is insane. So I do think if Iraq War happened now, Tony Blair wouldn't have stayed in power for as long as he did, because people knew their power, they knew they could vote him out. My mum was saying how back in the 2000s, a lot of people, all they knew was vote Labour, even though they knew what Labour was doing and what was wrong, they didn't know anything else. And also another problem was when the Iraq War happened, all the political parties supported it. I know the Lib Dems said they were against it, but I don't think they were really against it. Now, when Labour wants to go to war with Iran, and the Conservatives are supporting them, but now the Lib Dems and the Green Party and your party have said, no, actually, we don't support this. So again, people have an alternative, which they did with Iraq. But the unions, they're still very elitist and supporting that Tony Blair Blue Labour. I do feel that is, in the heads, and the best way to get rid of that is, I think unions, they need to start, your party need to encourage unions to join us and abandon Labour. And I think that's the only way we can get rid of that Tony Blair Blue Labour hold that is on the unions, by telling them, look, don't save Labour, come to us.
It's also important to think about what happened in Italy with these general strikes for Gaza. It's interesting to think that, yes, that definitely didn't bring an end to the war, unfortunately, but it did heavily reduce provisions to Israel. For some time, a ceasefire was called, and then it didn't last long, but now it's not as naked an aggression on the people of Palestine as it was before, which is not a solution, but it does show that that kind of mass action does have an important impact. I think it's also worth mentioning how political authorities in Italy have reacted to that strike, which was mostly organized by unions and activists. Basically, when the strikes were going on, other smaller political parties that have positions similar to the Linke in Germany or to your party in the UK right now, but are smaller in terms of size, they were very much trying to mobilize people across the country. The Democratic Party ignored everything and simply posted some stuff on social media about those protests going on and saying, well, you can't really blame them for protesting. It's human. They literally just posted a video of the protest with that song, I'm only human after all. And that's all they did in terms of commenting on it. But what happened afterwards is that even though they said they were not against the movement against the war, they eventually voted in favor of a bill called Anti-Semitism Bill, which criminalizes protesting in support of Gaza, of the people of Palestine. And I think it's important to think about how pressure is made on political parties and how certain things can lead some parties to move to the left.
Historically, victory of Shocker Adam in Leicester South. The last time that changed hands, because it was always been Labour, was 2004 by-election when the vote went to Lib Dems. It was Soulsby in charge then, the MP, and the protest vote, because there wasn't a genuine alternative, went to a completely
Yeah.
The Lib Dems are no alternative whatsoever. And this time, with Shawkat, it gives us a glimpse of what mass party could actually achieve if that was replicated across the country. And Labour, where they existed, would be under huge pressure to actually capitulate to that pressure, because they're going to lose their seats. And also it gives people hope that there is a different way of doing politics. And unfortunately, with the false starts on your part, the Greens have picked up that mantle a bit more. And the problem there is that they haven't got a socialist analysis of society.
So, first of all, thanks to the good discussion. Why did conscription stop? Firstly, it wasn't constitutional because they couldn't recruit as much as they would have had to make it fair, which is a pretty dumb reason. Linke and the Greens opposed it, and then in 2010 the SPD also, so the Social Democratic Party, like the Labour Party, also started opposing it officially, and then it just wasn't effective. We didn't need it. Was stopped. The position of the AfD to militarism is interesting because they are pretty friendly to Russia and China, but also for militarization. So we don't really know against who they want to fight, but they want to fight someone. Definitely want to arm and rearm Germany. And Die Linke in the second chamber of parliament actually voted for the 500 billion budget. They did that because they are in government in two states, and it's pretty controversial in the Linke. There's also the question if Die Linke should even like get in government, where we should say no, definitely not, and definitely not in a coalition with the SPD and the Greens. That's just a dumb idea. Then they thought that they were forced to move to vote for that. Yeah, they weren't. You could just have abstained or something. But they did it. Got more than a few members out of the party who were like active, and especially those who joined just in January of last year were definitely not in favor of that, because they saw this as one of the main points. And just to the why did conscription stop? Now we are opposing like the reintroduction, because it's just an act of militarizing the society and workers' movement and strikes. That's definitely one of the main focuses of our work in the school strike movement, to get the unions involved. There are also steps in that direction. For example, at like the school strike in Kassel, where I'm from, like the chair of the local union spoke and stuff like that. So we are trying to get it, but as political strikes are forbidden under German law, it will be a pretty difficult fight. Let's see what time brings. To Die Linke and Iran, there was an email to all the members, which shows that Die Linke is really two parties in one, like in progressive activist like a kind of party, and one bureaucratic opportunistic. Two chairmen of the party. They didn't even said stop the war. They just said, yeah, maybe it's not good under like international law. So it's against international law. That's bad, but we don't have to stop it. They didn't say that, but they just didn't call to stop it. So it was pretty crazy email to read. Yeah, it's like really two parties in one. And I think the situation with your party is pretty much similar. Yeah, so